Ian Zelitzer, a historian and professor at Princeton University, Brian Morgenstern, a Republican strategist, Alice Hennigan, a political analyst, and Dylan Byers, a CNN senior reporter for media and politics. Welcome back to all of you on a lovely Sunday. All right, so I want to begin with this tweet that the president sent yesterday urging his followers to watch a show on Fox News. And when they did tune in, they watched the host call for Speaker Ryan to step down. The president has apparently since told Speaker Ryan that that's not the sentiment that he was trying to convey. This is what was said.
Paul Ryan needs to step down as Speaker of the House. The reason? He failed to deliver the votes on his health care bill.
Okay, so conservative websites are really running away with this, even though we've heard through Athena's reporting and otherwise that the president says this is not my sentiment. So, Dylan, what are you learning about the backstory of this tweet, the fallout, the whole sequence of events?
Well, the claim, at least coming from sources in the White House that I've spoken with, is that this was not at all meant to impugn Ryan. The president wasn't trying to draw people's attention to this notion that Ryan somehow needed to step down. If you remember from yesterday, that countdown clock on Fox News was actually advertising new details, new developments on this notion that Donald Trump had been under surveillance while he was president-elect. So I think that may very likely have been what he was referring to when he sent out his tweet. Now, I will say it's highly possible, it ultimately looks good for Trump if more of the responsibility for the failure of the healthcare legislation is offloaded onto Ryan. Mm-hmm. That said, he needs Ryan. And I think ultimately this White House has decided that while they don't want to bear any of that blame, they would like to continue working with Ryan because they have alienated the Freedom Caucus. They have certainly alienated Democrats. They're going to need one of those two groups if they want to be successful in passing any legislation going forward. So I think Athena's reporting is spot on, and I think at least in that regard we have to take the president at his word. Yeah.
So Julian, kind of lay out the landscape here. You know, the president, while he has been quoted as saying before, that he doesn't need anybody, I'll go it alone. He really does need to be able to work with the conservative, Freedom Caucus or the more moderate, Tuesday and group and even Democrats. So what kind of homework, would you assign for the president at this point in terms of how to negotiate, how to make deals as it pertains to working with Capitol Hill?
Well, the problems that he faces with the Freedom Caucus, he could just study what happened to the Republicans under Obama. The Freedom Caucus has enough numbers to cause problems on almost any bill in the House, yet their proposals don't draw support, certainly from Democrats and even from the handful of moderate Republicans that exist. So the best bet for President Trump, which is going to be difficult, is a coalition of moderate Republicans, a few Freedom Caucus members, and if he could get any Democrats who are vulnerable, that's the only coalition that will work. This is a Republican problem that he's facing. They have moved far to the right, this caucus, since 2010, and it's very hard to form a coalition or a compromise with there being a big presence in the caucus.
The president has, placed a lot of blame. He talked about blaming the Democrats, and then in his tweet, he did, blame conservative groups like the Freedom Caucus. Well, this was the chairman of that caucus this morning.
Well, I mean, at this particular point, I can tell you no one has been more self-critiquing than me. I can tell you, as I've looked at all of this, I said, could I have spent a little bit more time? Should I have spent more time with the Tuesday group, more time with Democrats to find some consensus? And so as we look at this today, this is not the end of the debate. This is like, I had one of my friends call me the other day. He says, it's like saying that Tom Brady lost at halftime. We're not. We may be in overtime, but I can tell you at the very end of the day, the most valuable player will be President Trump on this because he will deliver. He's committed to the American people, and we're committed to helping him get there.
So, Brian, is it kumbaya?
Well, it has to get closer to kumbaya because there are so many problems with the existing healthcare system that it seems to be unsustainable, and going without a fix seems to be an impossible option, or just not even an option at all. I think the question, if you're not going to have Ryan as Speaker, and I think you will continue to have Ryan as Speaker, it's who else is going to do that job? I mean, the job of Speaker, a lot of people compare it to sausage making. I compare it to herding cats. As soon as you have one's attention, another one darts under the bed chasing a mouse. It's really hard to keep everybody on the same page long enough to pass a bill. And the question you have to ask is there someone better at unifying the caucus? Is there someone better at working with the White House? And it's just hard to find a more sort of unifying figure than Ryan at this point. But, they need to get on the same page and fix this thing. It's just a matter of, is there anybody better to do it? Probably not.
And there are a lot of divisions, and perhaps this whole battle for health care helped reveal the schisms, the divides are very great. So Ardana Bash and Jim Acosta have been doing some great reporting, getting some real details of what it's been like, in the rooms with the president leading up to, pulling that vote. And in one meeting held with moderate Republicans, reportedly lawmakers went around the room, answered, where they stood on the bill. And when Congressman Charlie Dent said he was a no, Trump reportedly replied, quote, "Why am I even talking to you?" So that kind of blunt talk may have worked, on real estate deals, but it doesn't appear to be that effective as it pertains to politics, does it, Jillian?
Well, it can be, but I don't think the threat itself is very effective. I think the threat that legislators respond to is back in their district. And if they are feeling that either from the right or the center that they are going to lose in the primary going into 2018, that will get them to move. But just an empty rhetorical threat doesn't move members of Congress. It never has. It won't right now. And I think he has to learn that. He has to really think about how to change their incentive, thinking about how they could keep their jobs.
Ellis?
Well, listen, Donald Trump, it all comes back to him, doesn't it? He shows up in Washington and then he expresses surprise that there's a Congress there, right? I mean, I understand he was a businessman, but you would expect some level of interest and engagement in the political system as it is. It turns out, I guess, that being a real estate developer maybe isn't really such a good training for this job. And maybe the apprentice idea really is more his view of the presidency, not a television show. So
in that same reporting of, Dana and Jim Acosta, they talked to people who had some familiarity with what happened in that room. And one, caucus member described Trump's approach to this health care bill by saying, quote, he wanted to talk about the big picture. But what was absent, Dylan, according to some in the room, at least this one person in the room, saying he didn't seem to know specifics about the deal. And so it was difficult for him to persuade anybody if he's not able to sell it by knowing the product.
Well, right. That's absolutely right. And that's where we're seeing the, inexperience start to have sort of real world ramifications. Sean Spicer, the White House press secretary, went out and said time and time again that the president had left it all on the field, that he had done everything in his power to try and whip the votes and get this bill to pass. Muhammad Ali left it all on the field in 1974. The New England Patriots left it all on the field in the last Super Bowl. Trump did not leave it all on the field. This was not the sort of fight that you've seen from past presidents when they really want to push legislation through. And I think it's I think it's waking up to a harsh reality for the president to understand that getting deals done politically is much different from getting deals done in the world of business.
Brian, he does not usually exhibit being the personality who wants to change his style very much. But is this an occasion in which he's got to be self-reflective and say, you know what, maybe the way I do things doesn't necessarily work. This is a whole new ball game, and maybe a new strategy is afoot?
Well, I think his tendency to use public pressure on members, I think, is a powerful tool. I think maybe just directing it a little differently and finding the members who are gettable, and then finding a part of that policy that's going to have a big effect on their district, and then going to the district, landing in Air Force One and giving a speech about that. I think, maybe getting a little bit more granular in his applying of pressure, I think, might be the way forward. Maybe that's what's the lesson he takes out of this?
So it's been real contentious, trying to get this bill through. But we're also seeing in some pro-Trump rallies that it's gotten pretty contentious in certain parts across the country, too. One in California, this rally turned violent. At least one Trump supporter was beaten with a Make America Great Again sign, and the two sides had several scuffles there. So how much does this division and lack of unity fall on the president, Julian? Or if it doesn't fall on him, how important is it for him to address what's happening or unfolding in certain pockets of the country?
Look, some of his problems, whether it's the tension and violence at a protest or whether it's the chaos and failure on Capitol Hill, he has to take some of the blame. And part of it is him not addressing these kinds of issues when they emerge. Part of it is him distracting himself and distracting the Republican Party with tweets and issues that the GOP doesn't really want to focus on right now, and eroding the goodwill of his own party. So I think while he likes to blame many people for the problems he faces, it's time to look in the mirror and to see how some of this is being caused by his own rhetoric and his own strategies.
Ellis?
Well, I'd add one other piece to Julian's list there is that he really needs to learn this stuff in some detail. If you listen to the congressman who felt frustrated by it, one of the things they kept saying over and over again was that he just didn't seem to know the details of the bill. He couldn't actually make an argument for it other than to say, hey, we got to win something here. You got to be with me on this thing. You can't convince people to love something that they hate unless you can make a pretty specific argument. And next time around, if it's tax reform or whatever it is, he just better know the issue better.
Dylan, wouldn't most people think that he would know that?
You would hope that he would know that. Unfortunately, it's not the case. I mean, look, if I can just say something about some of those images you were showing in terms of the violence that's been going on. The president has a job beyond sort of presiding over trying to pass legislation through, executive orders, things of that nature. It's also about the tone of the country. It's about how Americans feel about themselves and feel about the society they live in. What leads me to believe that none of that is going to change is that so much of Trump's rhetoric throughout the 18-month slog that was the 2016 presidential campaign sort of, lent itself to some of this anger and frustration we're seeing. And that started boiling over during the course of the campaign. And if we're seeing it boiling over now, there's nothing about the way that the president behaved before he became president that leads me to believe that he's going to somehow become more presidential and sort of try and tone down that rhetoric. Just in the same way that, he's antagonizing both the Freedom Caucus and the Democrats at the same time when, like I said earlier, he's going to need one of those groups to pass any legislation through. I just don't see that happening.
All right, Dylan Byers, Ellis Hennigan, Brian Morgenstern, Julian Zelizer. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, straight ahead, new details on the formal investigation that Iraqi civilians in West Mosul allegedly were killed by airstrikes. That's next.